And I wanted to just read this paragraph because it is stunning on so many levels. So it says the US Treasury and Federal Reserve paid $150 billion for an 80% stake in AIG in a bailout announced on September 16, 2008. On September 22nd, just days after receiving this bailout, AIG spent $443,000 on a spa outing at the luxurious St. Regis resort in Monarch Beach, California, including $23,000 in spa treatments. AIG visited the Hill on October 7th, 2008, where the CEO defended the spending as necessary to maintain business. How did we get to a state where there was this little oversight on the spending of billions of dollars?
The way the senators put it, and this is all somewhere else, maybe later in the book, the way the senators put it was that Hank Paulson, who came from Goldman Sachs and was a Treasury Secretary at the time that all of this was started to happen. Tim Geithner came in shortly after, but that he went to Congress and he said, look, if you don't bail out these banks and brokers, there won't be a tomorrow. It'll just like the world will just collapse and that'll be the end of it. And they thought to themselves, they admitted this later, senators admitted this later, they thought to themselves, well, here's this guy who's so rich, spent so many years on Wall Street, is politically connected enough to be Secretary of the Treasury. Surely he knows what he's talking about. And so we have to believe him and just take him at his word without requiring any evidence or any proof or any explanation, and just start bailing out banks. And I think that's why there was no oversight. And some of these things started to come out, like the parties and the big events that AIG was throwing. And in fact, at some point, when questioned about why they would spend so much money on these conferences and luxurious hotels, the head of AIG at the time said, well, we wanted to retain our staff, so we had to keep them happy. And someone asked them, why retain them if they got you into this position where you're bankrupt? Like, it's not strangers from the outside who did this. It was your managers making decisions and your staff making decisions that bankrupted you. So that was their excuse for it. As those stories started to come out, that this spending was going on, I think at some point Congress just kind of had to slap their head and say, what, we should never have taken Paulson at his word. We should not have just said, oh yeah, you must be right because you're so rich, you must be smart. This is the thing that gets me all the time, is that so many people truly believe that just because you're rich, you must be smart. It can't have been anything except your sheer brilliance and love of humanity that made you rich and famous. It's absurd. So what happened then is that because the federal government started handing out these bailouts, all of the I don't know if you remember Glass-Steagall, that we had the separation in the U.S. between banks and investment banks. Yeah. The banks weren't allowed to invest in stocks, and then that was all repealed, I think, in the Reagan era.
I think it was actually Clinton that repealed Glass-Steagall, but I'll check that actually.
Yeah, I don't remember now. It's one of those horrible events in life that you try to flush away from your mind, like most of the 2000s have been. Anyway, so what happened was, so you had investment banks like Goldman Sachs who didn't do commercial banking and therefore were not members of the Federal Reserve System. They were governed just by the SEC. But because the Federal Reserve got involved with Treasury in rigging all of these bailouts, investment banks like Goldman Sachs changed their charter to become banks, just regular commercial banks. That way they would have access to all that bailout money. And it wasn't long after they got their bailout money and, the public forgot what happened, that they went back to becoming investment banks and gave up the commercial banking side.
Yeah. And like that bit where you were talking about, they just sort of, where Paulson went to Congress and was like, everything's going to end. You have to guarantee, you have to save the financial system. Reminds me of literally exactly what happened in Ireland. The government just agreed in the middle of the night, like on the verge of like banking collapse, they were like, "We'll guarantee it all," with no idea what the bill was going to be. They were just like, "It's okay, we'll pay for it."
It's such an insane thing to do. I mean, the whole point of having you want to have some guardrails around the system, right? So that if bad actors come in, it's possible to protect the public, the investing public. But those guardrails are limited for a reason, and that's so that you don't have this expectation of a bailout, which is the problem that we have in the U.S. right now. In fact, really, very few countries don't. There's a few, like Korea right now, South Korea, China is working on it. There's some countries that are really getting serious about, not giving this expectation that every time you fail, we'll step in and fix it. But we have this long history that creates what's called moral hazard in economics, and that's the idea that I, as a manager at a bank or a broker, can take as much risk as I want. I don't have to worry about any of the consequences because the government will bail it out. And we just have done this so many times. We just did it again with Silicon Valley Bank. They guaranteed not just what was covered by the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, but they guaranteed and covered every dime of every deposit by every investor, by every depositor, every customer in the bank. That's, like you say, like that, like you said, now, like no consequences. Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead. We don't care what how much it's going to cost it. We're just going to spend it all. It's an insane way to run a country.
Yeah, and I think I wanted to ask, actually, this ties nicely in with these partners that Timothy Geithner made when he was at the New York Fed, I believe. Basically using like unregulated LLCs in order to like buy and sell assets like on behalf of the New York Fed outside of the system. So it feels like, because of the lack of accountability, even when there are regulations in place that would say, okay, there's only so much money we can give you, they find a way to get around it.
Exactly. Absolutely. And this is leading into a topic that I'll be doing, doing some writing on, and intend to do some podcasts later on this month or maybe early August, this regulatory crisis. So what you have is this idea that at one point, at the initial point, all of these regulators say our regulations are sacred and we must stand by them, and the way that they're set is perfect and nothing should be changed. We'll tweak it here, we'll tweak it there, we'll make T+1 work. But there's another level of crisis and regulation where they say that, excuse me, what's happening right now is so extraordinary that we absolutely must break our own rules. Right now, all of a sudden, our regulations are meant to be are meant to be broken because we have a situation in front of us that's totally extraordinary. And that's what they did in 2008, many times before that, and then again in Silicon Valley Bank. So the rules are that if the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation doesn't have enough money to cover the deposits, which Silicon Valley Bank, because they decided to cover everything, every deposit, they certainly didn't have enough money for that. The rule is that they're to go to the Treasury to get more money, to get the money to cover that. Well, at that point in time, the U.S. Treasury was in fact trying to get their debt ceiling raised through Congress, who was not cooperating, because they had hit the limit of what they could borrow, and there just was no more wiggle room there. The deficit was high, the borrowing had topped out, and since the Treasury then didn't have money to give to the FDIC, rather than turning to Silicon Valley Bank depositors and saying, I'm sorry, these are the rules that we hold sacrosanct, that we all live by and cling to, they said, oh, let's just go to the Fed and get it from them. And that's what they did. And it was exactly what they did in 2008. They broke their own rules. It's honestly was not legal what was done in 2008 in terms of the cooperation between the Fed and the Treasury, in terms of the bailouts being run through private corporations, right? who had no accountability to Congress, but yet the taxpayers ended up having to pay for that. This idea that you can just break the rules when it suits you, and at other times hold everyone accountable to the rules because they're so precious. This is as bad as it gets. I just don't think it can really get much worse than it is.
Yeah, it actually reminds me of the waiving of the ECP charges during the January 2021 mania, when people wouldn't have been able to cover due to extreme cover their deposit requirements to the NSCC, and therefore the NSCC just decided that those deposit requirements were sort of not as necessary as they maybe had been considered to be.
We'll just waive it for now,
yeah,
and it allows them to pick winners and losers.
Hey, listeners, real quick, do you ever find yourself sitting watching the stock market like this? Well, now you could instead be ordering my book like this. It's the story of GameStop. You can purchase it with a hoodie, with acknowledgements, or just with the early backers edition. It's all about the GameStop story. It's the real story, not just what you've seen on films. It's exactly what has happened over the last 3.5 years. And with DFE back, I'm finally able to draw a conclusion to my book. Please pre-order it. It really helps me out. And you will get it eventually, I promise. Hopefully this year.